mean, there's a number of points I could make, and perhaps you can chime in as well after, as to what we've learned. And this is by no means exhaustive, but starting with the obvious point that climate is warming faster than many of us had feared, and the Paris target of 2 degrees Celsius will almost certainly be missed. Extreme weather events will, under these circumstances, only increase in frequency and intensity. And to change this, we need to shift mindsets very profoundly, and to do so by convincing people that climate change is, in fact, the serious issue that we've all said it is over the past couple of days. Joanna made very forcefully the point that Canada's boreal forest is a huge reserve of carbon. It's a carbon storage par excellence, and we should be doing our utmost to preserve and protect that against the depredations of industrial extraction of various kind. And that carbon sink is both in the forests and in the peat bodies that lie both beneath it and around it. Now, how do we get to these kinds of objectives? Fossil fuels will certainly have to be phased out sooner rather than later, and there's a number of ways that this can be done. Carbon pricing is certainly one of the tools that can be utilized in order to do this, but not the only tool. Regulations will certainly have to be a very important part of the process, and regulations that are enforced, no guidance notes. This is the real thing with teeth, okay? So action will also have to be not just by individuals, but certainly by communities and groups and social movements and civil society organizations if it's going to make real change. And we will need to confront authority if necessary and take the consequences. So I'm just looking at Angela and saying that. She'll go to jail first.
You're going to hide behind
won't
her?
collect $200. Now, one point that I'm really personally glad that emerged in the discussion a couple of times is that adaptation, I prefer the term strengthening resilience, because adaptation has a connotation of capitulation or acquiescence, but really what we want to do is to build resilience against climate change, because it's here. We can't escape that utter brutal fact, and we have to protect people. And we have to protect people particularly in developing countries where they have been the most vulnerable and the least listened to in terms of their needs and their vulnerabilities to whether it's inundations or droughts or other kinds of climate-related devastation. And this needs to be done urgently. Only $5 billion of the $100 billion Paris target for adaptation has thus far been mobilized. And to this end, Canada could consider, for example, redeploying the $4.5 billion that have been earmarked for the Trans Mountain Pipeline. This is Susan's suggestions from the Trans Mountain Pipeline to the Adaptation Fund. That would only have the effect of doubling our very meager ODA budget, which is around 0.26% of ODA, of GNI. And that's far below the average of the OECD Development Assistance Committee advanced donor countries. So that's a very practical position that we can consider putting forward. The issue of just transition came up, and there was some debate and discussion around that. But it's something that certainly warrants attention. How can we transition towards a post-carbon world without paying any attention to those who will pay with their jobs and will go into perhaps a void and not have prospects to move to. The WTO and the multilateral organizations should be made part of the solution rather than part of the problem, which they have so often been. And to that end, we had some suggestions from Rohinton as to border carbon adjustments and organizational governance reforms, taking a cue from the CGIAR, the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research. Can this model be applied to climate change, innovation, and research? So there's another option for multilateral cooperation for us to consider. So, I mean, that's just a sample of some of the things that surfaced from our discussion. There are many more, but I'm going to ask Susan if there are some that particularly caught her attention as well.
Is this on now? Great. Is it? Can you hear me? Good. There are a couple things that I would add. I think that's a pretty good survey. We didn't really get as many of the ones from right this afternoon just before we got up here as we could, and we will definitely, you want it closer?
Well,
We'll definitely add some more.
I meant to include the need for a toilet reform strategy and to go after the septic tank mafia. I think that's something that has to be there.
Yeah, first the oil mafia, though. I'm particularly interested in you were saying that we need to have action. And I think to have action, we have to recognize a few things. We need to be involving women and Indigenous and looking at their solutions, local solutions, and particularly local food solutions, as Martin has mentioned. And I think what we really need is a vision of a better world, a vision of what we want. And Corrine mentioned, Joanna mentioned, a number of people mentioned that we have to have a vision of what we want, which is different from now. So I think that is going to be a really important step, I think, because it's hard to fight for something, you can't get there unless you know where you're going. You can't get there from here. And we need to really do some work on that better world that we could be living in, or we're not going to get there. So that's the main thing I would add. Although the other thing I thought was interesting is when we come to each of these issues, it's like the Sustainable Development Goals. How many of you knew that the Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations goals, that you saw all those pretty pictures, they are supposed to apply to developed countries as well? And so for food security, for example, we heard the example here in Canada, we are food insecure. We import our food. We are very vulnerable to climate change, both here and abroad. If we don't help people abroad, we don't get our food. And we sell crops. We've got crops that we sell, but we don't eat them. Similarly, for actions for pressure for change or strengthening resilience, we need to do that both home and abroad. We need to strengthen our resilience here. You heard about loneliness, you heard about divided communities, you heard about, communities fighting. We need to be strengthening, we need to apply a lot of these solutions both here and abroad at the same time. That's, and we're interested if there's any really pressing thing that you think we should have included right off the top that we've totally missed.
Okay.
There's one.
Evelyn?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
This is not my idea, it's tangential, but last night as we were leaving... Sorry, this is not my idea, and it's tangential, but as we were leaving last night, somebody mentioned to me that she thought MBAs and probably all business courses should include at least one climate change or two climate change seminars, and this could be a really practical recommendation. Thank you. And whoever it was that raised that, if you're here, maybe you could put up your hand. Anyway, she's not here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple here. Yeah. Over here.
I regret we haven't heard a single time all day the word nuclear, and it is the nuclear that is the #1 threat to all of us. The world is still here this evening. We should every meeting and every day, every get together, say, oh, the world is still here. We haven't had the accident with the radar or rocket today. So maybe this evening before we've left, we'll all be dead from a nuclear armament accident. Thank you.
Susan, I think the other audience that we perhaps, women, Indigenous, and youth. Because it seems to me, and kudos to the group of young people who've come up from New York to join us, but it seems to me, and certainly the other organization that I'm involved with, the UNA, has made a focus on engaging young people, giving them, many young people are in the forefront of the vanguard, if you will, of the activists, but there are also an awful lot of young people that are feeling left behind, feeling like there isn't a place for them. And one of the things that my other organization, the UNA Canada, has done is to say we're going to focus our activities largely on a youth audience. And that has included a program that's been involving young people in work opportunities and mentoring opportunities with 6-month placements in small and medium eco-friendly businesses and or other organizations and practices. And this has been a practical way of saying, and all of us have ideas about practical small ways in which individually and as part of the groups we belong to can make this real in what we're doing on a daily basis.
Thank you. Over here.
I'd just like to reinforce the mindset point that you made and a point that Susan made earlier on about the number of people who are actually interested in making progress. As somebody not an expert, I am actually shocked by how much you talk in acronyms and you know all these things. Well, I don't know all these things. And we're living in a new age where, yes, there's intelligent television some of the time. There are certainly in-depth media. The National Observer is one, but there are many others that are wonderful ways for people to educate each other. And I don't see why it should only be MBAs who actually get something on the environment. We need stuff in schools. It should be a requirement for everybody graduating from schools. It should clearly be compulsory in every first-year course in university. We're one of the most educated, university-educated countries in the world, so this is a wonderful way of changing minds. I also haven't heard any mention of social media. This is a new way. You know, 1 hour movies are a luxury for many people. 30-second, 2-minute stuff that can be moved around the Twitter world can do an enormous amount. Your first speaker this morning doesn't have a TED Talk. Well, make a TED Talk for him and make a summary one. Those facts are not known to my children or my grandchildren, and I think if we knew them, we wouldn't actually have to carry out as much civil disobedience as some people want. That's frustration, civil disobedience. There are many, many very positive things that can be done. I do not understand why this government has not put money into not only raising awareness about the issues you've been talking about, but getting people motivated. And those are very realizable with the sort of communication tools and skills that we have. We don't need Hollywood, we need Canadian stuff on this.
Thanks, Irvin. A couple more, perhaps. One more here. Oh, Manfred wants to. Okay.
Hello, my name is Sylvie. I think that it was a very rich seminar that we had. It must have been very difficult to choose a subject for all the panel. I just wanted to share that I was in Paris. I was in the street with signs and participated in many workshops. And one of the things that I brought back from there is about the third pole. And so if you don't know what the third pole is, it's basically the Himalayas. and around Tibet. And if you look at your map of the world, you will see that we have quite a large percentage of the population that is being fed by the water of the third pole. And people were coming to me because I had Canadian signs all over my backpack and hat, and they were saying that, you know, when the third pole melt, they're hoping that Canada will take them as refugees. So I know we talked a little bit today about immigration and impact on refugees, but environmental refugees by the millions, I think that we're all going to need to open our hearts. So thank you for the conference. Just wanted to share this thing that is still thinking about how we're going to welcome the third pole population here.
Thank you, Sylvie.
Lynn Adamson, I'm with Voice of Women for Peace and Climate Fast. And I wanted to say it's been a fabulous conference. I'm so inspired. Really, thank you so much. Yes. And I'm really hoping that we'll stay in touch somehow. You'll collect the ideas and initiatives from everybody that's been here and send us news a few weeks from now and say, here's what's happening if you want to connect. Here's some things to connect with. And what I would offer for that is that I'm involved with Mitchell Beer from the Energy Mix. For people who get that, we're working with Climate Action Network and other groups to do something called the Future Possibilities Tour, which is to go into communities in suburban and rural Ontario. We're focusing on Ontario, but we'd love it if people would like to do this in other parts of Canada as well. But with people who haven't been engaged, who don't see themselves as environmentalists, but they do care about the future, they do care about their kids. So we're designing that tour, and if people are interested in that, we'd love to invite engagement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Manfred, last word, perhaps.
And Richard?
Oh, Richard. I didn't see Richard.
No, just Manfred?
No, I didn't see Richard.
I just wanted, again, to say it was a wonderful conference, but I would, first of all, pick up on the point that it's clear that it is a wicked problem. There are no simple solutions, but there are many solutions. But as we look at those many solutions, we do have to keep bearing in mind that we have to pay extreme attention to the analytic problem and the political problem of differentiating between the relative importance of various initiatives. And unless we find a way of confronting the forces that are pushing the consumerist economic model in which we are enmeshed, and dealing with the accumulated financial obligations that weigh down all political and economic structures at the moment, I think we will not be able to make headway. Difficult as those issues are, I think they have to be central to our thinking.
Thank you. Last comment from Richard.
Sorry.
Yeah, Richard Harmston, Group of 78. I just wanted to elaborate a bit on what the two of you have said about the follow-up to the conference. This, for the Group of 78, is the start of this issue. We have had other events in the past dealing with various aspects of environment and climate change, but this is the first full conference we've held on this issue. And we see this as a starting point for the group to be much more and deeply engaged in this issue in the weeks, months, and years ahead. Therefore, we're taking the results of this conference, the rich dialogue that has gone on here, and the points, the arrow points of policy change and social change that we would like to see coming out of it. We would like to take those and, with those in hand, join with other organizations who are much more advanced in dealing with these issues than we are, and other people, groups, citizens groups, and to see what we can do to mount a campaign or join other campaigns so there can be a lot more social action, political action on this issue that we can participate in and reinforce and accelerate the action that's needed to make substantial change. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I don't see any more hands up, and oh, sorry, I didn't see.
Yeah,
Yeah, Anthony.
So it's 2 points. One is just to stress that it's been mentioned a few times that Canada's targets are incompatible with the Paris Agreement temperature objectives. that I think it was in Karen's presentation, the graph that showed that Canada is a climate debtor if we're going to take a fair allocation of the global carbon budget of what we're allowed to emit before we get to a certain temperature. Talk about that's important to stress because it means that the dialogue needs to be about accelerating climate mitigation, and that there is a conference happening, I think in Poland in December, that is going to set the rules and some guidelines for the Paris Agreement. So it will be important to start, if we're going to be doing campaigning from now on, to start talking about Canada taking leadership on that. The other point I wanted to mention, which wasn't really discussed too much, but Manfred brought it up at the beginning, was the idea, or just the fact that we consumers are in an astronomical amount of debt. We're at record high levels of debt, and part of that is because of monetary policy and the interest rates being so low for a while, but that is just driving consumption, and people are in a vicious circle of debt right now, and it's part of the business model to get people to stay in debt and have to service off debt payments and interest. And it's extremely lucrative, and the banks are involved in this, and a lot of companies are involved in making money off of people living off debt and having to produce and consume. And that's something that we didn't get into too much detail about, but we did speak slightly about economic restructuring and taking on some of those issues. And that could be something that would be interesting to explore more.
Okay, thank you. And no. Okay.
So I'd like to say that I'd like to expand the nuclear point out to war and security. That did come up, the link of climate change to war and conflict. So we can certainly add that. And also the education point certainly can be expanded to include universities, learning for a sustainable future, other education things, and the role of the media. As you know, with the founding of the United States, they seem to have forgotten that now, but the role of the media by de Tocqueville from France, who came to advise them, told them that a proper media informing the public was essential to the actual operation of democracy, and we've seen that being a problem now for our democracy, and I'm sure that Manfred will pick that up next year's conference.
Anyway, thanks to all, both people here in the audience and people who have been speakers as well, for a fantastic day and a bit. I can't promise to do this all the time, but we can perhaps do it some of the time. But as Susan was hinting, next year we're going to be dealing with very similar but different issues related to inequality, globalization, and democracy, a nexus of issues that are really at the forefront today and will be for some time. So please do think about us next year and attending our conference at that time.
Well, thank you very much for being here, because the quality of the conference is fabulous speakers, but it's also the quality of the audience. Thank you very much.
For those who haven't done so, please remember to take out to become a member.
Yes, join.
Oh,